one of the major failures of post-colonial Arab countries is education. Okay, there were some ups and downs, right? But generally today the situation is just terrible. Okay, and particularly in Egypt. I don't know if you're familiar with the education sector in Egypt, but it's just a disaster. If there's a word that's worse than disaster, then I would use that. It's just terrible. Okay, for people who can't afford to pay. If you can afford to pay, then you have private alternatives, and that's fine. You have very good institutions. The American University and other universities are very, very good. It's fine. But for the vast majority of the people who cannot afford to pay, it's just awful. And that's a reference to universities. If you look at schools, it's just appalling. It's just terrible. Obviously that needs to be fixed. I mean, Egypt is a very extreme example. Other countries are not so bad. My country today, after decades of war and occupation and sanctions, whatever, it's just awful as well. It didn't used to be that bad. In the 70s, it was a lot better. But nowadays, it's completely collapsed. So obviously that needs to be fixed. It affects everything, right? Because if you have someone who basically hasn't learned anything at school, they're forced to go to school, but they just don't learn anything. They just waste their time completely. If you want to know more about this, we can talk about it afterwards. But they just don't learn anything at school. Okay. Maybe the only things they learn are negative, like how to cheat and how to bribe teachers and stuff like that. Okay. Where you just don't learn anything for 15 years, and then all of a sudden you're left out into the world. Obviously, it affects your work sector. The capacity of people to get jobs and to engage in employment, whatever. It's very, very negative. In terms of academics and their involvement in the transition process, one of the problems that we're facing is that many of our academics, not all of them, but many of them have been co-opted by the previous regimes. They became very comfortable with those regimes. Many of them taught the previous constitutional framework for decades, right? And so therefore aren't very comfortable criticizing them, who actually thought that they were fine. Okay. Nowadays, when you engage with those people, it's very difficult to have a conversation with them. There's a real generational gap between those people who are established university academics, who are very, very conservative, who don't want anything to change, who think that everything was fine except that we had this very vulgar president. We're happy that he's gone, but otherwise that's just fine, right? We have a very huge gap between them and the rest of the people. The rest of the people just do not respect them at all, right? And the other problem is that these people who've been academics and established academics for a very long time have monopolized, first of all, the space for debate, and also have monopolized, the advice. They're the only people that people turn to for advice. So if the United Nations or a particular organization wants to get advice about something in Egypt, they'll always turn to the same people. The usual suspects, right? And everyone else is left outside of the picture, right? So you have very young people, modern people who have great ideas, who are completely excluded because you have these very old and conservative, co-opted people that are there. And our struggle is to try to overcome that problem. Okay. But otherwise, in terms of education, this transition process, generally speaking, has been a huge educational experience for everyone. It's a huge transformative process. People are understanding a lot more about what their state should look like, what's wrong with our state, how to resolve this problem. Okay? So it's not happening in a very structured way through universities, right? But it's happening anyway. So through ad hoc meetings, discussions, and so on and so forth. Some of them are conferences, some of them are training sessions, whatever. There are all sorts of different mechanisms. Okay? But it's happening. It's really happening. When I first arrived in Egypt after the revolution, it was just a few weeks after Mubarak was deposed. I met with a small group of people that were very important in the revolution, and we were talking about how the new constitution would be drafted. And what they were saying was that this is going to be very easy. We have lots of academics in Egypt. Okay, we'll get 3 or 4 of them, and they'll write a new constitution in a few days. It'll be very, very easy. Okay. So, I was a little bit surprised at the time. I didn't think that was the best way to write a new constitution. Then I met with the same group of people 6 months later, just a few months later, and they were singing a completely different song. They were saying, this is our constitution, we have to draft it, we don't trust those people anymore, this is for the future, it's not for the past, and so on and so forth. And every 6 months you would really feel this huge improvement every time, and it's continuing. So, the formal education sector hasn't been reformed yet in Egypt. It needs to be, okay? But in the meantime, we also have these informal mechanisms that are helping people as well. Well, the Arab Spring definitely did start that demand, but there are other demands too. So, more democracy, more input from the people into policy, less corruption, nepotism, and so on and so forth. But one of the demands was definitely more socio-economic and more social justice. And in relation to that, what I can say is that the constitutions don't change anything, because the previous constitutions all said the same thing. They all said social justice and socio-economic justice and socio-economic rights. They all said that everyone should have the right to work and the right to strike, and they all said that type of thing. So the new constitutions just basically repeat the same provisions with some small modifications here and there. It's essentially the same, So, but for me, the question as to whether or not these new constitutions or the new states will be able to achieve these rights will depend on whether or not the system of government is capable of delivering. So capable of delivering, first of all, in the sense, will they be able to understand the demands of the people, the concerns of the people, okay? And second of all, will they be able to deliver, okay? So being able to deliver depends on whether or not policy can be implemented in a coherent way by the government, and also whether or not there is coherent oversight on the implementation of policy. And that's a very critical thing to get right. In my country, in Iraq, our constitution is very, very weak on implementation of policy and on oversight of policy. In Tunisia, it's better, but it could be improved even more so, So, the oversight mechanism is still somewhat flawed, but we're hoping that they can make some improvements, okay? In terms of whether or not policy is going to be properly implemented under the new constitutional framework, there's still a lot of uncertainty, So we're hoping that they'll make some more improvements in the future. In terms of Egypt, it's basically all the same. There's a lot of confusion, perhaps even more confusion than in the past, because previously the president would appoint the prime minister, and that's it, okay? It's a very undemocratic process. No matter who is elected or not elected, obviously the elections were farcical anyway, but even if, the whole parliament was opposed to the president, it didn't matter. The president could appoint anyone he wanted to be prime minister, and they would have no say in the matter, okay? Now, under the new arrangement, okay, so there's a democratic process to elect parliament, and a democratic process to elect president. But there's a balance between the two in the Constitution. They try to come up with a semi-presidential system somewhat. I don't want to exaggerate this, but they try to come up with some type of balance between these two poles. Okay? And one of the consequences of this is that there's no clarity as to who will be able to control policy. Is it the president or the prime minister? We don't know. Okay? What it says is that the president will establish policy in cooperation with the prime minister. What does that mean? We've got no idea. Okay? In the past, it didn't really matter because obviously the prime minister would be aligned with the president, okay? And in any event, the president didn't care what anyone wanted, right? And the president would make that very clear. The president would often say, I've changed the policy, but don't think that I've done it because you asked me to. I did it just because I want to, okay? Nowadays, they can't say that anymore, okay? But it could easily happen because of the constitutional framework today, where you could have a president and a prime minister who are antagonistic to each other, where the prime minister is appointed by a majority of parliamentarians, and the president is not in favor. In that type of scenario, what will happen? We have no precedent for that. And so you should expect a certain amount of chaos, in the way in which policy will be determined and implemented in that type of context.